Okay, so you've made the decision that you want to have a graph in your report. What you want to think about is how you're going to format that graph. So you've chosen the right graph. If you're not sure about that, watch the compendium video. But now you've got to think about, how do I format it? Because again, the same thing applies. The same message has been in all these videos about writing reports and working scientifically, is you've got to take ambiguity out of the information. You've got to make it possible for the reader to interpret what your thoughts were and what your processes were as easy as possible. So formatting is key. So let's go through this. Well, you're kind of thinking about maybe, well, I wasn't sure what kind of graph was appropriate. Well, again, go and have a look at the compendium video on that, which will actually have this same slide. But that notwithstanding, this is actually really important. When you're formatting a graph, you've got to do it in a way that is meaningful. So you've got to display the data in a meaningful way. So that means we've got to have appropriate axes, we've got to have appropriate symbols, and so on and so forth. What a graph, when you format it, isn't, it's not an advertisement of data, right? So it's not who can do the poshest, graph. It's not about, whiz-bang three-dimensional purple and blue columns or whatever it is. It's about a demonstration. And the best demonstrations of anything are simple. So the notion is true. Keep it simple, stupid. Because the more simple it is, the easier it will be to follow. So it's about the notion of human perception. We're trying to use a format on our graph, so this links both the formatting and also the choice of graph, but we're making the formatting as appropriate as possible to make it as easy for the reader to interpret it as possible. So when you're thinking about the format, as well as the choice of the graph, it's partly driven by the data set. So that's something to think a little bit about, because that will have a bearing. But we'll see this in action. So your job, in terms of formatting, as well as choosing the graph, is actually to make life easier for the reader. It's about taking ambiguity out. So what you're hoping is that you're not forcing the reader to really have to concentrate enormously and almost have to do the work for you. You should be doing the work for the reader, in other words, presenting the graph in a way that is really easy to interpret. You don't want to burden them perceptually. You want to make it really easy to understand. So these are kind of the big clues. So the first thing is labels and keys. So the labels need to be easily detectable and easily read. So the no-no is you should not have a label like you can get in Excel which sits inside the graph. Okay, that comes out. You delete that. That doesn't apply. That is not an appropriate formatting style. It leaves all sorts of issues to ambiguity, because that label that you use if you use Excel is based upon what you have personally labelled your columns. And it may not be what you have been using as you've been writing the report. So labels need to be easily detectable and easily read. So let's have a look at some examples. Here's our label for our limits of agreement. Move him up so we can see him. And you can see that the label is not on the graph, it's sitting underneath the graph, and labels for figures and graphs always go beneath them. And it's figure 3, so it's telling us in terms of the order that these are appearing in our report, what number it is. And then it's got an explanation about what is going on. Now, if you had got something which has got more than one data, this is in essence a scatter plot. So by definition, there are not multiple symbols. But if we've got multiple symbols, we need to explain those multiple symbols. So let's see that in action. So here on our bar graph, we've got 2 data sets. We've got our FE and we've got our RP. But notice again, it's got here figure 1, grip strength scores separated for males and females, which are clearly labelled, but it then states FE equals elbow fully extended, RP equals arm fully raised. So again, the labels and the information and the key are all embedded underneath your figure. They should not be part of the figure itself. Rule 2, Contrasts. So contrast a light background with dark symbology or dark symbols. And the very, very important principle here is graphs should not be in colour. The reason they shouldn't be in colour is because colour brings in ambiguity. Remember that you're trying to make this information as easily accessible as possible. It is very possible that you can have somebody reading this that is colourblind. It is very possible that you can have somebody reading this that is visually impaired. It is very possible that you can have somebody reading this that finds differentiation, not just colourblind, but just differentiation between colours difficult. So black and white graphs are appropriate, or if you have to do any form of differentiation, it's shades of grey, and they've got to be quite distinct shades of grey. And that is the same whether you're using bars or whether you are using lines. And make sure that you follow that process, and make sure that those contrasts are really obvious. So again, let's just see this in action. So here we've got a slight differentiation because it's been done with greys, but notice you've got a white background and you've got the black columns or the grey columns. And even when we do our scatter plots, which are our limits of agreement here, everything is black and white. The only differentiation that has been made is where you have got the dashed lines and the solid lines. The dashed lines are showing the 95% confidence intervals, and the solid line is showing us our, in this case, our bias score. But it's all in black and white, which means it's visually easy to read and interpret. As soon as we start adding colour in, we start adding ambiguity into our own message. Rule 3, symbols. So you've got to use symbols which are appropriate and distinct. So you want to make them stand out. So if you are, for example, reporting data where you have got line graphs and you have got more than one line on the graph, make sure that the symbols are very, very different for those graphs. Make sure they're big and clear. Notice how big those circles are. The standard format on Excel is, I think it's a 0.5. These are 0.10. So again, if you use a 0.5, that's the size, the scale 0.5, to put those together, you will see that they're not that clear. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about kind of how to format graphs in Excel, there is a companion video on how to do that. But the symbols have to be of the right size. And then finally, symbol shape. So use what are called geometric shapes. So you don't want to use obscure shapes. So for example, in it is possible to have X's, or it is possible to have even just Y's as a shape. They're really hard to differentiate, particularly when they're kind of overlapping. Circles, squares, triangles, either filled or unfilled, are the most appropriate kind of symbols to use. So those are kind of the basic principles in terms of formatting. What are the other things we have to think about? Well, we have to think about the obvious things that you see here. The graph has its axes labelled, and the axes are labelled highlighting, stating what the axis shows, and, if needed, the units of measurement. So you can see that quite clearly here, both on the X and the Y axis. Secondly, you can see it on this graph here, whereas the X-axis doesn't need the units explaining, but it's clearly telling you what each of those columns relates to, whereas the Y-axis, again, has got the units stated. The next rule to think about is when you are using data which is a mean value, as we have here, you have to provide the error bars. The error bars are either going to show, depends on what decision you have made in your report, are either going to be based upon the standard deviation or the standard error for that data. You can actually do it even on confidence intervals, but it generally is standard error or standard deviation. And again, depending upon how you have formatted your graph, you may show those as both positive and negative error bars. We've chosen here just to show them as positive because we've filled the columns in. But you may well want to show them just one way or the other. You need to make the size of the graph overall appropriate. The size of this graph, which is, see if we can highlight it for you, is well over 2/3 the width of the page. It's big. You've got to make it stand out. It's got to be readable. Make sure that there are no grid lines on the graph. Grid lines are a standard feature in software such as Excel, which is what most people tend to do their graphs in, but grid lines are distracting because grid lines will get in the way of your columns, and grid lines will sit over the top of your error bars and will make it hard for the reader to interpret what's going on. It's about taking ambiguity out of the data. Make sure that when you are formatting something like a bar graph that you see here, make sure that the column widths are wide, so the columns stand out, and that the column gap between those is reduced. You want to fill the space because you're trying to convey your message. And then the final thing in terms of basic formatting of the graph is think about the scale on your axes. If you have got two graphs which are, say, I don't know, imagine you've got graphs of VO2 max, and you've got VO2 max before training and after training as an example, and you're showing all the data. You have to have the same scale. So in this example here, we've gone from 31 to 39. You don't need to go from 0. But we have gone up here from 31 to 39. We've gone up in 1 kilogram increments. You would use the same approach in the second graph, were you to do a second graph, because otherwise the comparison doesn't become possible for the reader. It becomes ambiguous. You can make it look like a really big change by simply just altering the scale on your axis, but that is actually allowing the reader to misinterpret the information that you are providing. And then the other things to think about, again, make sure with the labels that your title of the graph isn't in the graph like Excel allows you to do, that the key isn't in the graph, that you have for your graph, you have the title, so we make sure it's the right title number, and we have the description of what the graph is about and an explanation of what is actually being shown in that graph, irrespective of whether it's a bar graph or whether it is, for example, an XY scatter graph here. If you are creating a panel of graphs, as we have here, so you can see that these are a panel, make sure that the graphs sitting in the panel are also labelled. So here we've got, this is figure 2, but within this we've got 3 graphs, which is A, B and C. So they are labelled and then can be clearly tied to the information that is at the bottom. It's about removing ambiguity in all the information that we've got. So those are the basic things in terms of formatting for graphs. If you want to know more about picking the right graph, watch the companion video on how to select the right graph.